The wine in his goblet was the same shade as the blood of his son, executed only hours before. Yet, across the banquet table, the father raised the glass to his lips. He didn't scream. He didn't lunge for the emperor's throat. He smiled. In the flickering torchlight of the Palatine, the man drank to the health of the monster who had just murdered his child, because he knew that in this room, grief was a death sentence for the rest of his family. This wasn't a nightmare. This was a Tuesday in the court of Gaius Julius Caesar. Before he was a god, he was a mascot named Little Boot. But history remembers him by a different name, Caligula. And this is the story of how he turned the greatest empire on earth into a slaughterhouse. The history of the Julio Claudian dynasty is often remembered through the lens of madness and bloodshed. But the true depth of Rome's descent during this era is not found in the gladiatorial arenas or on the frontiers of Germania. It is found in the bookkeeping, deep within the administrative archives of the Palatine Hill, buried between the mundane manifests for Egyptian grain shipments and the payroll logs for the Praetorian Guard. There existed a set of ledgers that defied the moral logic of the ancient world. These scrolls did not tally bushels of wheat or ingots of Spanish silver. They tallied human dignity, quantified in distinct, taxable units. To the casual observer, the imperial palace in the late 30s AD appeared to be the apex of civilization, a sprawling complex of marble, gold leaf, and Tyrian purple. Yet, behind the porticos, the residence of the emperor had been transformed into a bureaucratic machine of violation. This was not the impulsive, chaotic lust of a drunken warlord. It was a state-sponsored enterprise, cold and clinical. The Roman historian Suetonius, writing with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, describes a system where the princeps, the first citizen, did not merely break the law. He inverted it to turn degradation into a revenue stream. In a civilization built upon the rigid backbone of the mos maiorum, the ancestral customs that revered the sanctity of the family unit, the head of the household, the pater familias, held absolute authority. But Caligula introduced a terrifying new jurisprudence. If the emperor is the pater patriae, the father of the fatherland, then every citizen, every senator, and every noblewoman is merely his property, to be used, leased, or liquidated. The corridors of the palace were repurposed into a high-end lupanar, a brothel where the merchandise consisted of the wives and children of Rome's most ancient lineages. This was the casino of grief. Invitations were sent not as requests, but as imperial commands. Husbands were expected to attend, to sit in the galleries, and to offer polite applause, while the women who bore their heirs were subjected to the whims of the emperor and his highest bidders. But the true horror lay in the administration of it all. Scribes, men who had spent their lives copying poetry or tax codes, sat at desks with styluses in hand, recording the proceedings with the indifference of market clerks. They noted the names of the victims, descendants of the Scipios and the Jolii, and assigned them a monetary value based on their lineage, their beauty, and their reluctance. Every act of coercion was monetized. The proceeds from these nights were not hidden away in secret chests. They were openly deposited into the aereum, the public treasury, ostensibly to fund aqueducts and public games. It was a psychological masterstroke. By forcing the Roman elite to pay for their own humiliation, and by using that money to feed the Roman mob, Caligula made the entire city complicit in his perversion. He stripped the aristocracy of their defining armor, their dignitas. When a senator walked into the Senate House the morning after such a spectacle, he was no longer a statesman. He was a broken accessory to a crime, silenced by the knowledge that his name was recorded in the emperor's ledger, not as a colleague, but as a client in the sale of his own family. The machinery of the empire did not stop for morality. It simply processed the horror, stamped it with the imperial seal, and filed it away. Before the world trembled at the whisper of his name, the legions of the Rhine cheered it. But they did not cheer for an emperor. They cheered for a mascot. To understand the monster, one must first look at the toddler stumbling through the mud of a military encampment on the German frontier. The air here did not smell of incense and perfume, but of wet wool, iron filings, and unwashed bodies. Here, amidst the most fearsome killing machine in the ancient world, walked a 2-year-old boy dressed in a miniature general's uniform. He wore a tiny breastplate, a small sword, and, most delightfully to the gritty centurions, a pair of miniature, hobnailed military sandals known as Caligula. The soldiers, men who slaughtered barbarians for a living, were charmed. They laughed and called him Caligula, Little Boot. It was a nickname born of affection, a soldier's joke that stripped away imperial pretense. To the boy, Gaius Julius Caesar, the clatter of those heavy boots and the roar of the legions were the lullabies of his infancy. He was the son of Germanicus, the golden boy of Rome, a general so beloved by the people and the army that he was considered a living equal to the gods. Germanicus represented the best of Rome: honor, bravery, and stoic virtue. His son, the troops believed, would be the continuity of that light. But light casts long, dangerous shadows in the Roman Empire. This period of idolization was the only true safety Gaius would ever know. He was raised not in the soft nurseries of the Palatine, but in the shadow of the eagle standards. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was no shrinking violet of the spinning wheel. She marched with the troops, a she-wolf, who stood as a pillar of strength beside her husband. For a brief, flickering moment, the family was a tableau of Roman perfection. Then, the darkness descended in Antioch. In 19 AD, when Gaius was just 7 years old, Germanicus fell ill. It was not a clean death. The ancient sources, including the grim annals of Tacitus, speak of a slow, agonizing wasting away. The general's body was discovered to be riddled with signs of sorcery. Cursed tablets with his name inscribed upon them hidden in the walls, and the charred remains of human bodies found under the floorboards of his quarters. When he finally breathed his last, his skin turned black and blue, and rumors flew that his heart would not burn on the funeral pyre, a sure sign, according to Roman superstition, of poison. The little boot was forced to watch the destruction of his invincible father. The psychological rupture was absolute. The boy, who had marched with legions, now found himself in a world where heroism was punished with death. The safety of the military camp was replaced by the viper's nest of politics. The death of Germanicus was not just the loss of a father, it was the death of the ideal. The protective wall of his parents' power had crumbled, leaving young Gaius exposed to the predatory gaze of the Emperor Tiberius. The boots were put away. The nickname became a hated reminder of a lost paradise, and the child learned his first and most vital lesson. In Rome, to be loved is to be a target. The little boot was dead. The survivor was born. The island of Capri rises from the Tyrrhenian Sea not as a jewel of leisure, but as a fortress of limestone and paranoia. It was here, in the twilight of his reign, that the Emperor Tiberius retreated, transforming the island into a private theater of cruelty where the audience was captive and the exit was death for the young Gaius, stripped of his military boots and his father's protection. Capri was not a palace. It was a cage shared with the tiger that had devoured his family. To understand the monster Caligula became, one must witness the education he endured within the walls of the Villa Jovis, perched on a sheer cliff, dropping 1,000 feet into the sea. The villa was an architectural manifestation of Tiberius's mind, isolated, inaccessible, and filled with dark corners. Here, the elderly emperor, his face disfigured by ulcerous sores and plasters, indulged in depravities that would make the Roman Senate vomit in terror. Ancient historians like Suetonius detail the presence of spintriae, specialists in sexual perversion collected from across the empire, who formed triple chains of entanglement to perform before the emperor's cloudy eyes. But for Gaius, the horror was not sexual, it was existential. He was living with the man who was actively exterminating his bloodline. While Gaius poured wine for Tiberius at dinner, couriers were arriving with updates on the slow starvation of his mother, Agrippina, and the butchery of his brothers in Rome's dungeons. This was the crucible. Any slip of the tongue, any tear shed for his family, any flash of anger would have resulted in immediate execution. And so, Gaius developed the ultimate defense mechanism, a pathological dissociation. He became a void. He smiled when told of his brother's torture. He made polite conversation, while screams echoed from the torture chambers below the dining hall. The historian Tacitus later remarked with chilling precision, "Never was there a better servant, nor a worse master." Gaius didn't just survive Capri, he studied it. He watched as Tiberius ordered victims to be thrown from the Salto di Tiberio, the imperial leap. If the fall didn't kill them, marines stationed in boats below would beat the broken bodies with oars until the thrashing stopped. Gaius watched this industrial-scale murder not with fear, but with a fascination that slowly curdled into obsession. He learned that absolute power meant the ability to rewrite reality, to turn pain into pleasure, and murder into a mundane, administrative task. Tiberius, a man of keen intellect despite his madness, was not fooled by the young man's obsequious mask. He saw the glint in Gaius's eyes. According to the records, the old emperor once looked at the young prince and prophesied with grim satisfaction that he was nursing a viper for the Roman people and a phaeton for the world. He knew that by keeping Gaius alive, he was crafting a vengeance against Rome far greater than anything he could inflict himself. Capri was not just a prison. It was the incubator where the little boot was shed, and the beast was fed its first taste of blood. The smell of burning flesh hung over Rome like a shroud. In the autumn of 37 AD, barely 6 months into the reign of the Golden Boy, the Eternal City did not smell of triumph, but of desperate, industrial-scale slaughter. History records that in a frantic bid to appease the gods and save their beloved emperor, the Roman populace sacrificed over 160,000 victims, cattle, sheep, and oxen, in a span of just a few weeks. The smoke from the altars was so thick, it reportedly darkened the midday sun over the Palatine hill. But the gods, it seems, demanded a price far steeper than livestock. The illness that struck Caligula down was sudden and catastrophic. Physicians of the time, helpless against the invisible assault, watched as the 25-year-old ruler convulsed in the grip of a fever that defied explanation. Modern pathologists retrospectively diagnose this as encephalitis, or perhaps a severe manifestation of the falling sickness, which plagued the Julian line. But to the observers in the room, it looked less like a disease and more like a possession. He drifted in and out of comas, his body racked by tremors, his mind wandering through labyrinths of delirium where he conversed with spirits invisible to his terrified court. Outside the palace walls, the hysteria of the mob reached a fever pitch. The Jewish philosopher, Philo of Alexandria, a contemporary observer, noted that the grief was so profound it paralyzed the empire's commerce. In a display of fanatical devotion that would soon turn into a grim irony, citizens began to bargain with the fates. A knight named Afranius Potitus publicly vowed to give his own life if the emperor recovered. Another offered to fight in the arena. They were treating Caligula not as a political leader, but as a solar deity whose extinction would plunge the world into eternal winter. And then, the fever broke. The emperor opened his eyes. But the man who rose from that sweat-soaked bed was not the charismatic son of Germanicus who had fallen into it. The heat seemed to have cauterized the human parts of his psyche, burning away empathy, inhibition, and fear, leaving only a raw, exposed nerve of absolute power. Suetonius writes that his physical appearance had shifted. His eyes, once lively, were now fixed in a rigid and terrible stare. The charm was gone, replaced by a predatory stillness. The tragedy of Rome was that their prayers had been answered. The body of the emperor had survived, but the mind that inhabited it had undergone a metamorphosis. He did not wake up grateful for his life. He woke up believing he had defeated death itself. In his delirium, he had touched the divine, and he returned with the conviction that he was no longer a man subject to the laws of men, but a living God subject to nothing. The first act of this resurrected deity was to call in the debts of the faithful. He summoned the men who had vowed their lives for his recovery and, with cold, bureaucratic precision, ordered them to fulfill their oaths. They were forced to commit suicide or die in the arena, a gruesome lesson that set the tone for the rest of his reign. In the new Rome, the emperor's survival required the people's blood. The Golden Age had burned to ash in the fever of 37 AD. The age of the monster had begun. To understand the sheer scale of Caligula's detachment from reality, one must look not at the blood on the Senate floor, but at the silence in Rome's granaries. In the summer of 39 AD, the bread riots began in the capital. The mob howled for wheat, but the great storehouses were empty. The grain supply hadn't failed due to drought or war. It had failed because the Emperor of Rome had decided to wage war against the laws of physics. He had ordered the requisition of nearly every seaworthy merchant vessel in the Mediterranean. Hundreds of heavy transport ships, normally destined for Egypt and Sicily. These were not summoned for a military invasion, but to be anchored hull to hull across the 3-mile span of the Bay of Baiae. They formed a double line of timber stretching from Puteoli to the resort of Baiae, a floating scar upon the sea. This architectural monstrosity was the result of a grudge held against a prophecy. Years prior, the astrologer Thrasyllus had told Tiberius that Gaius had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Gulf of Baiae. For a sane man, the prophecy would be a metaphor. For Caligula, it was a challenge. He commanded his engineers to pile earth upon the decks of the anchored ships, paving them with stone to perfectly mimic the Appian Way. He forced the ocean to become land, simply to prove the stars wrong. The spectacle that followed was a fever dream of antiquity. Suetonius describes Caligula donning the stolen breastplate of Alexander the Great, looted from the conqueror's tomb in Alexandria, and mounting his favorite horse, Incitatus. Clad in a cloak of gold cloth, he rode across the waves, followed by a train of Praetorian Guards and hostage Parthian princes. This was not a parade, it was a theological assertion. By riding on dry land, where there should be water, he was declaring his dominance over Neptune himself. But as night fell, the triumph over the sea descended into a chaotic purge. To illuminate his bridge, Caligula ordered so many torches and braziers to be lit that the bay shone as bright as high noon. Another victory, this time over the god of night. Drunken revelry consumed the floating road. As the wine flowed, the emperor's mood shifted from exaltation to malice. Historians recount that, as the crowds marveled at the engineering, Caligula ordered his guards to shove spectators into the black water. When they tried to cling to the rudders or the chains of the ships, they were beaten back with oars and boat hooks. The Bay of Baiae became a churning grave of silk robes and drowning screams, all illuminated by the artificial sun of the emperor's vanity. It was a microcosm of his rule, a technological marvel built on starvation, designed for a single moment of ego, and ending in a watery grave for those foolish enough to applaud it. The renovation of the Palatine Hill during this period was not measured in marble or limestone, but in the systematic dismantling of Roman morality. Caligula did not merely indulge in vice, he codified it, housing it within the very walls intended to project the majesty of the empire. The imperial palace, once the austere administrative heart of the Mediterranean, was reconfigured into a labyrinthine theater of compulsory hedonism, which Caligula cynically branded the Palace of Universal Union. This was no hidden dungeon. It was a storefront. To alleviate the hemorrhaging state budget, drained by his lavish games and the absurdity of the Baiae Bridge, the emperor opened a wing of the palace to the public as a high-end brothel. But the staff were not slaves or common prostitutes. They were the wives and sons of Rome's consuls, praetors, and highest-ranking senators. The layout of this establishment was designed with a terrifying theological arrogance. Caligula dedicated specific chambers to different deities, turning the act of violation into a warped religious sacrament. There was the cubiculum of Venus, draped in sheer cone silks, where noblewomen were forced to pose as the goddess of love, awaiting worshippers who paid the entrance fee. There was the Hall of Priapus, where the biological legacy of ancient families was auctioned off to wealthy commoners and freedmen. The historian Suetonius records the cold, mercantile nature of this enterprise with distinct horror. This was not a bacchanal, it was a business. An immense signboard hung outside the palace gates, listing the names of the women available and the prices for their company, calculated based on their husband's political rank. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air was thick with heavy saffron smoke, used to mask the smell of sweat and fear, and the corridors echoed not with laughter, but with the jarring clatter of coinage. Imperial clerks, the same men who tallied grain tributes from Egypt, now sat at tables collecting fees, issuing receipts for the use of a senator's wife. For the Roman elite, this was a torture far more sophisticated than the rack. In Roman psychology, a man's dignitas, his accumulated social worth, was inextricably linked to the sanctity of his household. By turning the senator's wife into a commodity, Caligula did not just assault a woman. He socially castrated her husband. He forced the aristocracy to become complicit in their own erasure. Senators were often compelled to stand by the doors, acting as doormen to their own shame, smiling as common soldiers paid to enter the rooms where their wives wept. Caligula framed this as a lesson in humility, a democratization of pleasure. But contemporaries saw the truth. It was a war on the concept of nobility itself. Dio Cassius notes that the emperor took a perverse, voyeuristic glee in these proceedings, treating the degradation of the patrician class as a spectator sport. By institutionalizing vice, he stripped the ruling class of their moral superiority, leveling the playing field until there was only one man left standing above the filth, the emperor himself, the pimp god of a broken Rome. The Curia Julia, the sacred meeting house where Cicero once thundered against tyranny, had been reduced to a claustrophobic chamber of held breath. By the middle of Caligula's reign, the Senate of Rome had ceased to be a legislative body. It had become a captive audience in a theater of psychological vivisection. The terror here was not physical, at least not initially. It was the terror of the double bind, a psychological state where every choice leads to destruction. Caligula did not merely want the senators' obedience, he wanted their souls. He understood that to truly break a Roman aristocrat, one must dismantle his dignitas, his public face. The emperor began to treat the conscript fathers not as colleagues, but as domestic slaves. Ancient sources describe scenes of surreal humiliation. Elderly statesmen, men who had commanded legions in Germania and governed provinces in Asia, were forced to run alongside the emperor's chariot for miles, dressed in their heavy togas, gasping for air, while Caligula whipped his horses, laughing at their stumbling, sweaty degradation. But the breaking point was the invasion of the family. The case of the Roman knight pastor, a grim archetype for the entire senatorial class, illustrates the depth of this psychological abyss. When Caligula executed pastor's son on a whim, he did not allow the father to mourn. Instead, he issued a summons for pastor to attend a banquet at the palace that very night. The atmosphere of that dinner was suffocating. The air was heavy with the scent of roasted meats and the metallic tang of terror. Caligula, reclining on his couch, watched pastor with the eyes of a viper, waiting for a single tear, a single crack in the mask. He offered the father wine. He offered him perfume. He proposed a toast to the longevity of the imperial line. And pastor? He drank. He accepted the perfume. He smiled. Seneca, writing on this incident, in De Ira, on anger, asks the chilling question, why did he smile? The answer is the essence of Caligula's tyranny. Pastor had another son. He smiled to save the survivor. He swallowed his grief along with the emperor's wine because he knew that in Caligula's Rome, sadness was treason. To mourn the victim was to accuse the executioner. This was the coercive complicity that shattered the Senate. Caligula forced them to vote thanksgivings for his atrocities. When he announced that he had slept with their wives, they were compelled to publicly thank him for the honor. He turned the descendants of Rome's heroes into a gallery of nodding automata, men who were so terrified for their children that they willingly participated in the destruction of their own society. The Senate did not fall because of a military coup. It fell because Caligula discovered that if you force a man to applaud his own humiliation long enough, eventually, he forgets how to stop clapping. On the stagnant, glassy surface of Lake Nemi, a volcanic crater known to the ancients as Diana's Mirror, Caligula constructed the ultimate monument to his isolation. Here, shielded by the dense forests of the Alban Hills, far from the prying eyes of the Senate and the judgment of the mob, he commissioned two leviathans that defied the logic of naval architecture. These were not ships designed to conquer the waves. They were floating palaces designed to conquer boredom. Archaeological recovery of these vessels in the 20th century revealed a level of technological sophistication that would not be seen again for 1,000 years. But in the 1st century AD, this engineering genius was harnessed solely for the purpose of depravity. The decks were not made of simple timber, but paved with mosaics of porphyry and serpentine, materials usually reserved for the temples of gods. The superstructures were supported by columns of marble, and the hull was sheathed in lead to protect it from the worms of the deep, a precaution for a vessel that was never intended to sail. Inside this floating city, the laws of Rome were suspended. Suetonius whispers of silken sails and sterns set with gems, but the reality was far more clinical and disturbing. The ships were equipped with heating systems, hypercausts running beneath the floors, and plumbing that provided running hot and cold water, delivered through lead pipes stamped with the emperor's name. This was a hermetically sealed universe where Caligula could play the role of a living deity without interruption. The Nemesis were the stage for the emperor's fascination with the cult of Isis and the moon goddess Diana. But in Caligula's hands, theology became theater. The vessels were reportedly fitted with rotating platforms, utilizing primitive ball bearings, a mechanical invention centuries ahead of its time, to allow statues, or perhaps the emperor himself, to rotate with the movement of the stars. Psychologically, the Nemesis represented the final withdrawal of the emperor from reality. In Rome, he was subject to the gaze of the people. On the lake, he was the master of a private cosmos. Here, the rites mentioned by historians likely involved the enforced participation of hostages and nobles in tableaux that mimicked the chaotic lives of the Olympian gods. It was a place where the boundary between religious ecstasy and sadistic indulgence evaporated. The silence of the lake amplified the screams, and the water washed away the evidence. These ships were not merely vehicles of luxury. They were the architectural manifestation of a mind that had decided it was no longer human, drifting endlessly on a dark mirror, staring at its own reflection, and seeing a god. He was a monument to a bygone era, a living relic of the old legions. Cassius Chaerea was a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, a man whose skin had been leathery from the wind of the Rhine, and whose hands were calloused by the hilt of a gladius. He had served under Germanicus, Caligula's father, hacking through barbarian lines in the dark forests of Germania. By all metrics of Roman virtues, that defining quality of martial courage and masculine strength, Cassius Chaerea was unimpeachable. But in Caligula's palace, heroism was nothing more than a setup for a punchline. The conflict that would bring down the dynasty was not born from high-minded Republican ideals, but from a specific, grinding ritual of emasculation. History, through the accounts of Josephus and Suetonius, records that Caligula had fixated on Cassius Chaerea with the cruelty of a schoolyard bully who knows exactly where to strike. The emperor mocked the tribune's voice, claiming it was too high, too soft, too womanly for a soldier. But the abuse did not stop at insults. It was woven into the daily military protocol. Every evening, the tribune of the watch was required to approach the emperor to receive the signum, the military password for the night. This was a sacred duty, a transfer of authority meant to secure the safety of the princeps. Caligula turned it into a nightly obscenity. When Cassius Chaerea approached, standing rigid in his armor, Caligula would lean in and whisper words like Priapus, the god of the erection, or Venus, the goddess of love. or sometimes simply amor. These were not tactical codes. They were slurs, implying that the battle-hardened veteran was a passive sexual object, an effeminate dancer rather than a soldier of Rome. If Cassius Chaerea extended his hand for the customary ring-kissing, Caligula would offer him his middle finger, wiggling it in an obscene gesture mimicking sexual penetration, accompanied by lewd noises. The younger guards, sycophants desperate to please the emperor, would snicker in the background. For Cassius Chaerea, the humiliation was total. It was a dismantling of his identity. In the Roman mind, to be a man was to be the penetrator, the dominant force. To be cast as the passive recipient was a fate worse than death. Caligula was not just annoying him. He was socially and psychologically raping his protector. Night after night, the psychological dissonance was deafening. Cassius Chaerea looked at Caligula and saw not a god, but the spoiled, rotting fruit of the general he had once worshipped. The irony was bitter. The man who had sworn to protect the son of Germanicus was being forced to destroy him, to preserve the honor of the memory of Germanicus. The conspiracy that formed around Cassius Chaerea was not a political cabal in the traditional sense. It was an act of desperate sanitation. He was joined by other tribunes and senators, but while they whispered of liberty and the republic, Cassius Chaerea's motivation was far more primal. He was not killing for the state. He was killing to silence the voice that called him a whore. The emperor had spent years sharpening a blade, testing its edge against the stone of his own arrogance, never realizing that he was handing it to the one man in Rome who knew exactly how to use it. The end of the monster did not come with a thunderclap from Jupiter, nor with a legionary battle cry. It arrived in a cramped, dimly lit corridor where the only sound was the scuffling of sandals on stone. It was just past noon, on January 24th, 41 AD. The Palatine Games were in full swing, a sensory overload of noise, color, and staged violence. But beneath the roaring stands of the theater lay the Crypto Porticus, a subterranean artery connecting the imperial boxes to the palace. It was a space designed for privacy, cool and echoing, where the light filtered in through high, narrow windows, cutting the gloom into slices of dust and shadow. It was an acoustic trap. Caligula had hesitated to leave his seat. Historians recount that he was suffering from a nausea induced by the previous night's gluttony, his stomach turning, debating whether to bathe or stay for the next act. The fates, it seems, gave him a shove. He rose, deciding to take a shortcut back to the bathhouse to cleanse his pores. He was separated from his German bodyguards, massive men, fiercely loyal to him, not out of politics, but out of a simple, canine devotion to the hand that fed them. For a few fatal moments, the living god was alone, save for a few conspirators and a troop of noble boys from Asia, whom he stopped to inspect for an upcoming performance. The scene described by Josephus is cinematic in its tension. The emperor, clad in silk, stood chatting with the terrified youths, oblivious to the men closing in behind him. He was relaxed, perhaps even happy, anticipating the afternoon's entertainment. He did not see Cassius Chaerea approach. Cassius Chaerea, the man mocked, as a woman. The soldier, humiliated for his voice, stepped into the light. He asked for the day's password one last time. Some sources say Caligula, true to form to the very end, sneered a final obscenity, perhaps Jupiter, creating a blasphemous equation between himself and the king of gods. Cassius Chaerea didn't flinch. He shouted, "Acciperatum! "Receive this," and brought his gladius down, not like a soldier, but like a butcher. The first blow was clumsy, striking the emperor's jaw or collarbone. It didn't kill him. It only broke the spell of his invincibility. What followed was a frenzy of released pressure. Caligula didn't scream for help. He didn't beg. According to Suetonius, as he fell to the mosaic floor, writhing in his own blood, he cried out, "I am still alive." It was the final delusion of a psychopath who had bought into his own divinity. He truly believed he could not die. But the conspirators were done with myths. They swarmed him, stabbing him over 30 times. The violence was specific and symbolic. They didn't just target the heart or the throat, they targeted the man. Blades were driven into his genitals, a savage receipt for the years of sexual taunts, a reclamation of power by the men he had forced to bow. The cold stone of the crypto porticus became slick with the divine ichor, which turned out, to everyone's shock, to be just red, human blood. When the German bodyguards finally arrived, bursting into the corridor with their heavy clubs, they found only a piece of meat, unrecognizable and silent. In their blind rage, they began hacking at innocent bystanders, confused by a world where a god could be turned into carrion in the span of a heartbeat. The theater of terror had been closed, its lead actor dismantled in the dark, leaving Rome blinking in the sudden, blinding light of a vacuum. The morning after the assassination, the loudest sound in Rome was not the weeping of mourners, but the rhythmic strike of iron against stone. The Senate, in a frenzy of collective guilt and desperate revisionism, attempted to enact the damnatio mem or ei, the condemnation of memory. They sought to scour the name of Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus from the timeline of human history. Across the city, a grand act of sculptural surgery began. Marble heads of the emperor were not merely smashed, they were carefully decapitated and recarved. With a few strokes of the chisel, the sneering visage of Caligula was smoothed and reshaped into the likeness of his uncle Claudius, or his ancestor Augustus. It was a practical, cynical recycling of power. The bronze coinage bearing his profile was recalled and melted down, the metal returning to a shapeless, molten state, as if the heat of the furnace could purify the economy of his madness. But the erasure required blood as well as fire. The Praetorian Guard, realizing that a half-dead dynasty is a dangerous thing, hunted down the remaining threads of his immediate family. His wife, Milonia Caesonia, who had stood by him through the fever and the sadism, was put to the sword. His infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, the child he had carried to the temples and paraded as a goddess, was killed with a brutality that shocked even this hardened society. The guards smashed her life out against a wall, ensuring that the little boot would leave no footprints for the future to follow. Yet, the Senate's attempt to scrub the stain was a failure. You cannot execute a precedent. Caligula had died, but he had left behind a terrifying discovery. The Roman Empire could survive a monster. He had proven that the institutions of Rome, the Senate, the courts, the legions, were hollow shells that would support any burden, no matter how grotesque, provided the man on top held the purse strings and the sword. The senators who cheered his death did not restore the Republic. Within hours, they were bowing to Claudius, cowed once again by the Praetorian Guard. They had hated the player, but they were addicted to the game. Caligula's true legacy was not the marble he built or the people he killed. It was the manual of absolutism he drafted in blood. He showed the world that there is no divine punishment for tyranny, only human consequences. And as the smoke cleared from the crypto porticus, the ghost of Caligula lingered in the Palatine shadows, waiting to whisper his secrets to the next monster, a boy named Nero, who was already waiting in the wings. The nightmare was not over. It had simply been passed to a new host. We like to dismiss Caligula as an aberration, a singular lightning strike of madness that scorched the earth and vanished. It is comforting to think of him as a monster, because monsters are rare. But the terrifying truth of his reign is not what he did, but what Rome allowed him to do. The Senate cheered, the fathers drank the wine, and the scribes balanced the books of atrocity. Caligula proved that civilization is a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark ocean of barbarism. He showed us that absolute power does not just corrupt the ruler, it rots the soul of everyone forced to obey him. The statue was smashed, the name was scraped from the wall, but the lesson remains etched in the stone. All it takes is one man to crack the surface, and we all fall in.